We're really delighted to welcome Professor Lisa Wolfe, who is our close colleague at Oklahoma City University. Not her first time delivering a Just Lunch for us. Professor Wolfe is the endowed chair of Hebrew Bible at OCU, also teaches for St. Paul's School of Theology on its Oklahoma City campus. She is an ordained minister for the United Church of Christ. She preaches and teaches regularly in the community and across the country. Dr. Wolfe's most recent publication, and what she'll be speaking about today, oh, I see it right there on the screen, is Qoheleth, or better known, I guess, in American circles as Ecclesiastes, for the Wisdom Commentary series, a really fine series. Her previous work included DVDs called Uppity Women of the Bible and a companion volume, Ruth, Esther, Song of Songs, and Judith, published in 2010 and 2011. And that one is not on the screen, so I'll show it here. That's in my office too. And Professor Wolfe is a noted speaker, scholar, teacher. She received in 2018 the Distinguished Faculty Award for Oklahoma City University's Honors Program and the university-wide Outstanding Faculty Award. She's done just so much innovative teaching that she's told me about, including work with some of the material that was gathered by the Museum of the Bible, but this was before it became that. She had her students up there working on Deuteronomy and other sources. I remember that pretty clearly. And she is just a wonderful colleague. And I would also have to say, as the host of the annual Newstat lectures, really just really, a wonderful member of the academic Judaic community here in Oklahoma, and we're delighted to have her back. Wish we could have her for lunch down in Norman, but some other year. Professor Lisa Wolfe, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Levinson, for that very, very nice introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about my newest book. I received this in the mail just about this time last year. So as you can imagine, the scheduled book talk at the local bookstore got canceled because COVID hit shortly after that. So it's really nice to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about the book. And I'll start just by saying a bit about the title. Dr. Levinson and I went back and forth a little bit about this. I mean, do people know what Qoheleth is? And so did the publishing company and my editors. So as I was working on this volume, one of the things I wanted to do, and is always my effort in my scholarship, is to try to place the book in its original context as much as possible as a starting point, and then add on interpretations that have come through the centuries beyond that. And the title Ecclesiastes really contains a word that has become so Christianized since the time that it was simply a Greek translation of Qoheleth. And so I wanted to give the book the title Qoheleth. We kept Ecclesiastes in parentheses for purposes of online searches and just for people who don't know that. But I think having them both there can be a point of teaching so that we can learn that's the Hebrew name of the book and arguably of the author. So I will start there and move on to talk a little bit about the commentary series itself, and then my strategy in writing a feminist commentary. So this wisdom commentary series is unique in that it offers a volume for almost every book. As you can see here, I have one on the screen that covers 3 books, but there's a volume for almost every book of the Hebrew Bible and into the New Testament. And the scholars who are writing on them, this one is Will Gaffney from Bright Divinity School. Many of the volumes are co-authored by one or two or even more authors. And the effort is to do something different in that it's a sustained feminist treatment of a whole book. So I'll talk more about that in a moment. Let me look next at the title page of the book. So you can see the general editor is Barbara Reed, and she's at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. This is her brainchild, is to do this full commentary series. And notably, for those who aren't in the strange circles of religious publishing, this is a hard time to be producing a full commentary series, even pre-COVID. Times are tough in religious publishing. And so to undertake this project was a big deal, and Barbara Reed has really shepherded the project very well. And then my volume editor is Atalia Brenner Edan, and I'll say more about her in a bit. The next slide is the contributing voices. So one of the uniquenesses about this commentary series is that all of us authors were asked to invite some additional folks, they might be scholars, they might not, to contribute other opinions about the text alongside what we're writing in our commentary. It's, I think, a bit of a nod to the tradition of rabbinic literature, where you would have more than one opinion on the page about a text. So it doesn't get quite so fun as the rabbinic literature, but at least we've got some other points of view. And I feel good about the way in which the various authors who contributed to my volume brought perspectives from around the world. And so to that end, I put their locations in bold, and I've gotten to know some of these authors. Mercedes Garcia Bachman is somebody I was actually in grad school with in Chicago. Funlola Oloyede I've met over the years at guild meetings. And again, Atalia Brenner Edan was the editor of the volume. So prior to this series, mainly what was done in terms of feminist interpretation of the Bible was something like what you see in these two volumes, which encapsulate 100 years. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the Woman's Bible. She wrote most of it herself, though she had hoped to have more contributors. And what she would do is go through usually individual passages, short pieces out of each book that very obviously related to women or women's issues. And then on the right side of the screen, you see the Women's Bible Commentary, which was an effort to update that work 100 years later, now that there were enough female commentators to fill a volume, which was something that Cady Stanton kind of struggled with in her time, partly because they didn't exist and partly because they were nervous about publishing because of the backlash they would have gotten. Now, the Women's Bible Commentary is now in its 3rd edition. I gave you the first one just to give a comparison to Cady Stanton's work. And you can see here in the center, one of Cady Stanton's classic comments about Qoheleth regarding chapter 7, verses 26 through 28, and I'll get to those in just a minute. Now, I'll also talk about Cady Stanton's assumption that Solomon was the author, which I do not share. So when we look at some of the other previous feminist treatments of Qoheleth, you can see how prominent Atalia Brenner's name is. And I was reading her when I was in seminary, so to have the privilege of working with her as the volume editor on this project was kind of indescribable. She has edited a lot of material for a good reason. She's a wonderful editor, very positive to work with. And her work in 1993 with Falkline van G. Chems, which actually even precedes her Feminist Companion series that were collections of essays. This work is something excerpted for one of those contributing voices where they talk, and this piece was Atalia's in the book, about the poem in chapter 3 that most of us are familiar with, A Time for This and That. And they, in that volume, were working to assign passages to an M voice for male or an F voice for female, which isn't exactly the same as the gender of the author. It's a longer argument, but in any case, I included that in my volume, and I came up with a bit of a different interpretation, my own, and they stand side by side. The other one that I want to point out is Jennifer Kusid, who wrote Permutations of Qoheleth, Reading the Body in the Book. And this newer interpretation of Qoheleth brings a much updated, interesting feminist perspective where she plays with gender and how it appears in Qoheleth. And she even talks about the idea of Qoheleth, the author, as transvestite. And so I used some of her work as background and really enjoyed working with that. But aside from those treatments, which were not full-length treatments of the whole book, this is the first thing that went through from beginning to end with an intentional feminist hermeneutic or lens, interpretive strategy. And that was, as you might imagine, tricky, because there are lots of parts of this book that don't mention women. Women seem to be absent. And so I was constantly asking myself, what do I do here? And so one of the things I'll be talking about today is that strategy and how I was looking for not only the obvious stuff, whether it was something positive about women or outright misogynistic, or maybe it was that women were implied, or maybe they were hiding behind the scenes, or I was just asking more generally, how might this have applied to women? How could it apply today? And then I also used the term that I was grateful to have received from my friends and colleagues, Rabbis Abby Jacobson and Juan Mejia, gender bending. I'll get to that on a later slide, and how that occurs a little bit in this book. So with that, let me first talk about the title of the book, which is also assigned to the author, Qoheleth. This is a feminine gendered participle, Qoheleth, and as most of us know who study languages that have grammatical genders, that may or may not have anything to do with biological sex. But I figured for a feminist commentary, it's worth consideration. And so one of the things I did was give Qoheleth, the author, if as it were, an opportunity to tell us who they were. And to that end, I declined to assign gendered pronouns to Qoheleth throughout the commentary, which took a good bit of discipline. Nearly everyone for all time has called Qoheleth he and him, and I called Qoheleth either avoided gendered pronouns or I used they, the generic that has come into vogue. And I did that in order to leave open the option, which I'm not the first scholar to have considered the possibility that Qoheleth could even be a woman writing in a man's voice. So I left that open with the invitation of the gendered term itself. This next slide is getting us toward the most egregious verses in a Qoheleth, which are 7:26 through 28. And these verses lead up to it. And they're important because, as you can see in the yellow, the author is highlighting wisdom, an important aspect of this book. This book is known as part of the wisdom corpus, along with Job and Proverbs. And so here Qoheleth is talking about seeking wisdom. You can see that in the blue, and also talking about wisdom being far from me in the green, and how can I find it or find her? You can see I put one pronoun in the feminine form. The gender, the grammatical gender of wisdom is feminine, so fair enough to call wisdom she. The other background here is from Proverbs. I'll get to that more in a bit, where wisdom is personified literarily as a woman. So these passages about this search for wisdom lead us to verse 26. So here is the misogynistic verse in the book, and many scholars have used that term, myself included, over the years. And I put that in bold. And more bitter than death, the woman who is a trap, a net is her heart, ropes are her hands. One who is good before God will escape from her. The sinner will be captured by her. And so again, in green, you see Qoheleth's attempt to find her. That is wisdom, as I'm thinking of wisdom here, and also seeking in the blue. Now, before I get to my interpretation of this, I want to talk a little bit about the history of interpretation of this passage. And this is the one part that every feminist commentator has always commented on. So of course I had to do this, and I'll get to some of the other stuff I did as well. The part that I excerpted is as one of my contributing voices. I didn't mention it on my opening slide because it's not an author, but it's a very old book called the Malleus Maleficarum, the Latin for the hammer against witches, which, if you didn't know, was the second most popular book for 2 centuries. It just trailed behind the Bible. And the tragedy is that this was a book that explained how to prosecute and persecute witches. And it really drove the great witch hunt of the 16th through 18th centuries in Europe. The numbers are greatly disputed among scholars of this time period, but somewhere between about 90,000 trials and then 45,000 deaths. You'll see some numbers that are much higher and some that are lower. That's probably a middle of the road number, 75% of whom were women. So this was really a handbook for persecuting women in that time, and many died because of the material in this. And the reason I excerpted this in my commentary is because in one part of the Malleus Maleficarum, we get 726, which I had just showed you on the previous slide, especially that phrase, more bitter than death, is repeated 5 times in the Malleus in order to villainize women. And so the biblical text is there used to justify the business of prosecuting and persecuting witches, both male and female, but mostly female. So I feel like we have an obligation as scholars of the biblical text to be aware of, to unearth, know about, and critique that history of interpretation, but then to go on and reinterpret it. And my interpretation of this passage puts it into conversation with what we see about wisdom in Proverbs, where wisdom is personified as a woman. Actually, wisdom is personified as a woman, but what I have on this slide is the other personification, female personification in Proverbs, which is the strange woman or woman folly. And so I gave you a couple of excerpts there. And in my research comparing Proverbs, the women in Proverbs, this is just in Proverbs 1 through 9, where you can find woman wisdom and her foil, woman folly, or the strange woman. In my analysis of those, my hunch is that Qoheleth may have been referring to woman folly as the sage was seeking woman wisdom. The frustration with Qoheleth is that they only found woman folly or the strange woman and could not find woman wisdom. So that puts it in a different, that frames it very differently than the really strictly misogynistic seeming phrase that we get here, more bitter than death, the woman who is a trap. And in some translations, instead of the woman, and in some interpretations, that was viewed as having to do with all women. And so then it became, of course, more misogynistic. So I think the reinterpretation is important, but also the history of interpretation. And then one of my newly favorite novelists, Louise Erdrich, wrote on this passage a lovely little comment in this book, Out of the Garden. These words have stood through time in thought, no doubt have been spoken from pulpits, used to punish uppity and opinionated women, been cited as God's actual credo on the female subject. These are words that have done historical harm, and yet they were probably written in the same short-sighted spirit that any gender uses in complaining about the other. That barstool spleen, taken as divine revelation, casts a sick pall upon the acquired wisdom of Qoheleth. Such a marvelous summary of the history of interpretation of this passage. So I included that in the commentary, and I wanted to share that with you today. Now, before I move on, I just realized that I meant to mention some of the other voices who didn't get formal contributions in the book. And one of those was a marvelous gathering of women in the sukkah behind Temple B'nai Israel some years ago, when my friend and colleague, Rabbi Vered Harris, invited a dozen or so women, both Jews and Christians, to gather in the sukkah during Sukkot and very appropriately discuss Qoheleth and our views of Qoheleth as women. And so some of those views, I think kind of in the spirit of Louise Erdrich here, are also included in the book. So let me move on to what I call here gender bending in Qoheleth. And as I mentioned before, I got that term, and I give them credit in a footnote from Rabbis Abby Jacobson and Juan Mejia. And there are a couple of instances in Qoheleth that invite me, I think, as a feminist interpreter, to wonder about the issue of gender in this book. So in 722, we have a Kativ Kure situation, and I tried to explain that as well as I possibly could. In other words, one thing is written, what's on the left side of your screen, yet there's a rabbinic tradition to read it in a different way, and we find that in the marginal notes. And the way that the pronoun in this verse is written is in the feminine singular form. And the way that it is read is in the masculine singular form. And so that gives us some, perhaps, insight about who the audience is. And it introduces some ambiguity about, was this a group of, male sages sitting around and learning from the old male scholar, or maybe was this a mixed gender group? We can't know, but I think the ambiguity that is there is worth looking into. So that's one of my instances of gender bending. And the next one that is a kind of a classic instance in the book of Qoheleth is in 727. And I tried to make this as clear as possible, even for those who are not Hebrew readers, to show you in the red that the last letter on the word Amar, Amra, which makes it the feminine form. So the feminine form of a verb applied to Qoheleth would be a little mind-blowing, because everybody was assuming this was a guy. Why would he be using the feminine form? And so the traditional, the common emendation is to just take that last letter and move it to the beginning of the next word. And if you've ever seen any ancient Hebrew manuscripts, you see how closely together the words are. It would be a really easy thing to mistake over the centuries of copyists. And then the next word becomes the Qoheleth, or the philosopher, as I like to translate that, rather than Qoheleth without the definite article. And again, we can't know for sure, but I took this as an opportunity to think a little bit about Qoheleth's own gender identity, and is this some kind of an invitation to wonder about that, to question it? And so I detail some of the history of interpretations of the few scholars, but they do exist, who have wondered about that idea about Qoheleth as male or female, masculine or feminine, somewhere along the spectrum. As I said, Qoheleth mentions transvestite, and again, we're all thinking of this more in literary forms than in kind of as it's not as though we're thinking we can assign a literal biological sex to Qoheleth. So the next category of material that I will address is the times in Qoheleth when women are mentioned minimally. And the passage I'll lift up here is from chapter 2. And in chapter 2, we see Qoheleth is conducting, the text says in 2:1, a test of pleasure. That's one translation. It's a test of enjoyment. The sage is acquiring all kinds of luxuries to try to see what will give me pleasure or enjoyment. And along this list, we get, as you can see on the first line, male slaves or male workers and female slaves. We also get along this herds and flocks and gold and treasure. So kind of a checklist of luxuries. And then in verse 8, we get this really difficult line. So I gave you the NRSV translation, singers, both men and women. Okay, that's not so disputable, but there again, we have a woman women who are mentioned minimally, along with female slaves. And then at the end of that verse, we have what we scholars call a hapax legomenon. It only appears once. We're not sure what that word is, so I gave you some of the optional translations: coffers, concubines, waitresses, breasts. So maybe it has something to do with women, is what many commentators have thought. Not all. As you'll see on my next slide, I gave you some of the possible translations we've gotten throughout the centuries. Musical instruments and that of all sorts from the King James Version, oddly enough. Seow says humanity's treasures in chests, and then Kruger has women and more women. So this is one place where women may be hiding. And it's a part that I took very seriously as an interpreter, because here women and men as workers are commodified. We have human beings who are commodified. We have perhaps, maybe likely, sexual commodification in this list. And the other thing that I want to mention is that at the end of this test of pleasure, if we were to continue on in chapter 2, we would see that Qoheleth's conclusion is the theme word of the book. Maybe you know it in English, maybe you know it in Hebrew. So in Hebrew, it's hevel. In English, it has typically been translated vanity. I have a whole other piece on that I'll give you on my final slide. I like to translate it absurdity, but it can also be translated worthless or futile. There are many debates and arguments about how to translate hevel. One thing that I thought a lot about is the fact that Qoheleth went through this list of luxuries and decided in the end, this is absurdity. And I wondered about what that meant for Qoheleth as an author, as perhaps an elite person. For any of these people who are objectified in this list, who are counted along with objects and herds, what does it mean to them that Qoheleth concluded this is hevel? Does that mean that everything is absurdity? Does it mean that they're absurdity? What does it mean to a person who struggles for food or for freedom to say that this whole list is hevel? And so that leads me a little bit to, I'm going to skip a slide here for the sake of time, to places where women are hiding. I'll come back to, well, I'll move back. Women are hiding in a lot of places in the book, and one of them are just in the philosophy of it all. Women care about these things as much as men. So, and certainly as much as this sage, Qoheleth. Okay, well, I can't resist. Let me go back to this slide just for a second. Everybody knows this section, chapter 3. 1 through 8 is a poem. I think Qoheleth lifted it and used it in order to comment on it. But I found women implied here, perhaps. So in 3:2, you're probably humming in your head now that Pete Seeger song, To Everything, right? Turn, turn, turn. And the King James translation of this says a time to be born, even though that's probably not the best translation of the Hebrew form of the verb here. And I have a somewhat lengthy, rather technical discussion of that. The bottom line is it's probably better to translate a time to give birth, which is, of course, distinctly a female act. And then I mentioned a time to weep, because especially in the ancient world, we see that the conducting of funerary rites and weeping and wailing was distinctly woman's activity as well. What I did in that poem is I looked at every verb in the poem, and I looked at every place that occurred elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible canon to see, was that verb ever associated with a woman anywhere else? And after doing that, what I concluded was there's every reason to think that this poem would have been something that women felt included by, even in the ancient world. And so that was kind of my strategy for doing a feminist interpretation of this poem. All right, so now more back to more of women hiding. I mentioned the test of pleasure in 2:1 through 11, and how we see women and men objectified and put over against the subject and or the speaker. I also think a lot about the carpe diem. So I mentioned hevel, the theme word, but there's also a theme phrase. Carpe diem is how we scholars summarize it, because we like to use Latin. So seize the day. And I gave you one of my favorite instances. This occurs 7 times throughout the book in varying forms. Eat and drink and enjoy yourself. Eat and drink and be merry, we see in Kings. And so Qoheleth likes this phrase, carpe diem. And I wondered, what would this mean to ancient women and even to contemporary women? And in the ancient world, one thing we know is that making food was typically women's work. And I wondered, can you seize the day if you had to fix the feast? Can finding joy in life rely on someone else's servitude? So I thought that was something worth reflecting on there, not only for women, but more broadly for the workers, whether they are slaves or otherwise, that Qoheleth mentions, and what is their experience. And then chapter 11, verse 1, this was a really fun part of the book. I had long been aware that Michael Homan, who I list here on the slide, had made the case that chapter 11, verse 1, which seems really obscure, he had made the case this might be about beer making, because he's someone who has studied the material culture of beer making from the ancient world. And he reads this verse and says, this sounds just like how they made beer in the ancient world. You would bake bread, you would put it in water, and then after a while, it turns into beer. And they would drink it through perforated straws, or they would put cloth over the top and strain it out to drink. And beer was a really important part of the ancient diet, because the small amount of alcohol that developed during the fermentation process would help purify the water. Homan and Ebeling, Jenny Ebeling, an archaeologist who does a lot with women's material culture in the Iron Age, they have made the case that because women baked the bread, women made the beer. And so that became my invitation to spend, I don't know, 3 or 4 pages talking about ancient beer making, which was a pretty fun part of the book. And so that would be a great example of where women might have been hiding in the book, though Qoheleth doesn't mention them at all. Now, one question we could ask is, well, if Qoheleth was male, how would he have known about beer making? Probably by the time the book was written, beer making was being done in more industrialized settings, or at least group settings, And besides, even a boy growing up in the home would see his mother doing it. But it could also reflect a woman's authorship if we want to think about that possibility. And I also think about this verse, if it has to do with beer making, is a really nice link to the Carpe Diem, right? Eat and drink and enjoy your life. So I'm getting toward the end here because I want to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. But I wanted to give a good hearty nod to some of the scholars who assisted me through their work on ancient women. So one of the things I tried to do was to get as good a sense as possible of the context of ancient women from both material culture and ancient literature. And so these are some of the authors who I use. There's Jenny Eveling right in the middle, whose work I mentioned before. And I would just give a quick shout out to that book. One thing that is really cool is she writes a fictional account of an Iron One woman that goes throughout the book. And in each chapter, it's a different part of her life. And she includes the fictional account of the life. And then she uses the archaeological research to support that. And so weaving it through this way, and it's a nice short readable book. It's a great study book that I would recommend. So these scholars really helped me to think about how ancient women might have heard, even participated in some of what I was reading and interpreting on in Qoheleth. Finally, some broader places where women might be hiding would have been in issues of hierarchy, power dynamics, marginalized groups, economic disparities. There are several places in Qoheleth where we get mention of the rich and the poor, and those are things that in classic feminist theory, those are the types of things that we would want to be looking at. And then the philosophical reflections. I spent a fair amount of time thinking about how Qoheleth's philosophical reflections would have affected ancient women. And I'll just say a bit about death, for instance. When we look at the experiences of ancient women, every time they faced a pregnancy and childbirth, they were facing their own mortality very clearly, as well as a very high infant mortality rate. And so I think that Qoheleth's reflections about death would have been absolutely relevant to ancient women. And then finally here on divine justice, that's something that I've always been really interested in Qoheleth, because Qoheleth questions the traditional views of divine justice, that the righteous are rewarded and the wicked are punished, and says instead in chapter 8, I see, based on experience, I see that the righteous are treated according to the acts of the wicked, and the wicked are treated according to the acts of the righteous. That classic theodicy, why do bad things happen to good people? And so with that and other of Qoheleth's experiences in mind, I end with an afterword that is about Qoheleth as a model for feminist hermeneutics, ironically, from a book that has one of the most horrendously misogynistic verses in it that's been used to kill many women. But the fact that Qoheleth is often referring to experience and says repeatedly, I saw, I saw, I saw, is the same move that feminist theologians and feminist interpreters have done, is to say, okay, I hear what you classic, mostly male, Orthodox theologians and interpreters have said, but here's my experience. And that's the way in which I think Qoheleth can serve as a model for feminist hermeneutics. And that brought me full circle to my dissertation work, which was titled Seeing Gives Rise to Disbelieving, where I put Qoheleth in conversation with feminist theology. So I will end with a quick, shameless self-promotion slide with some of my other titles, which thank you, Dr. Levinson, for already mentioning them. But I also have on this slide some things that are fairly easily accessible that I've written about Qoheleth. So there's a podcast on Not Your Grandma's Bible Study, and an entry on Vanity of Vanities, so Hevel in BibleOdyssey.org, which is a great website. If you don't use it already, you should. And then a piece that I wrote for Point of View Publishing that's also available. So with that, I will end. I will stop the share so we can all see each other a little better and invite any questions.
Lisa, thank you so much. I want to let people either just speak up, or I think if you're more comfortable putting it in the chat box, that's okay too. But either way, feel free to just chime in.
Lisa, this is Nina Livesey. I think we've met before. And even though I teach Bible as literature, I don't know all the books by heart or anything. I'm wondering if you can speak about, and I know dating is notoriously difficult for all of the books of the Bible. Can you speak a little bit to the date that, or the current thinking on the composition date of the book?
Yes, thank you. I'm glad you asked that question. And you said the right thing, of course. Dating is notoriously difficult, and more so with Qoheleth than with most of the books. Qoheleth does not give us much to work with in terms of dating. So we don't have references to historical time period that are substantive. I go with what's probably the scholarly consensus right now, which is about 250 BCE. And I really read Qoheleth in the Hellenistic period. I really get a lot of the sense of Greek philosophy in the book, and there's been a lot of great research on that. That was my first dissertation topic, actually, and then I found out that I really couldn't pin the book down very well, and I was going to have to do a lot more study of Greek philosophy before I could even get into that conversation very well. So there are some outliers there. I mentioned Chun-Liang Xiao at Princeton. His commentary placed Qoheleth in the Persian period, so earlier, a couple centuries earlier, and he made that argument based on it's a linguistic argument, and it really hasn't taken over. It definitely created a lot of waves in the scholarly world when he first published it, but most scholars are still going with approximately 250 BCE, so more or less 3rd century BCE. Thanks.
I have a question. How did authorship of Solomon get associated with this?
Yeah, good. Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned Solomon, because I think I said I would mention Solomon and I never did. So in the first verse of the book, or the superscription, 1:1, it says the words of the teacher, or I translate philosopher, Qoheleth is the word, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So that's it, son of David, king in Jerusalem. And there's also this tradition of associating Solomon with wisdom, which we get from Kings. Solomon was the king who prayed for wisdom. And Solomon is associated, of course, with the Song of Songs, which I very intentionally call Song of Songs and not Song of Solomon, because I don't associate Solomon with that book. But that's been the tradition that arose. And frankly, that association of Qoheleth with Solomon, and probably Song of Songs with Solomon, probably that's what got them into the canon, because the rabbis had some hearty debates about this book for good reasons. And did they belong or not? Were they holy or not? And to get Solomon's stamp of approval on there would probably is a big reason why it made it. I'm glad we have it. So I do want to say that as much critique as I have for Qoheleth, I do adore the book. I'm so glad, I cherish the book. Yet, while I'm glad we have Qoheleth makes me glad that we have the canon, and we have the hope in the Psalms, and we have the rich stories like Ruth, and we have the yearning for justice and the angry, righteous words in Amos, for instance. So that's sort of my final word that I forgot to mention. So thanks. Who else?
can I just follow up on Andy's question and your response, because I'm sure that some of the folks here don't necessarily know that the rabbis thought that Song of Songs was attributed to Solomon in his lusty youth, and Proverbs in his middle age at sort of the top of his game, and then Qoheleth when he was old and beginning, getting a little decrepit, because it is quite a lot of it of the book is quite a downer. And I'm wondering, do you just idly, do you think that the issue of the combination of misogyny and just nihilism, do you think that those were linked at all in commentary, either Jewish or Christian?
Wow. So do I think that misogyny and nihilism were linked? Not necessarily. I think probably hierarchy and economic stratification was probably more linked to misogyny. And I mean, maybe that I'm doing what authors do, critiquing my own comment, but maybe that's because in classic feminist theory, it's not just about women, it's about hierarchy, it's about social stratification and economic stratification. But to me, that seems more linked with misogyny than does nihilism. Okay. I think, and this gets back to my comments about the relationship of women to Qoheleth's reflections on philosophy. I think that nihilism is equally a women's issue, and I think maybe even more so for ancient women, for whom a pregnancy would have maybe very often been viewed as a potential death sentence. And so I wouldn't gender nihilism as a philosophical issue, but I like that idea. It's worth thinking about.
Thank you.
So just because I'm always interested, what are you working on now?
What am I working on now? Well, I don't have another big new project. Well, okay, I guess I sort of do. So there are some more biblical women that I'm interested in, and I started working on them some time ago. So Ritzpah, Deborah, Miriam, Machlanoah, Hogla, Milcah, Tirzah in Numbers, and Huldah, some other biblical women who get a lot less play than Ruth, Esther, Song, and Judith. And I've been working on teaching about them. Last summer, I did a lecture series on those women, and I linked the issues in those passages to the Black Lives Matter movement that was, of course, at the top of everyone's news feed at the time. So I'm interested in those biblical women partly because they haven't gotten much screen time for people, for lack of a better term. People don't know about them, and people are interested in them, is what I have found. They have a lot to teach us about the biblical text. In my first book, in Ruth, Esther, Song, and Judith, one of the conclusions I came to at the end of my song commentary was that we can't know that Song of Songs is in the canon and think that women are just minor players in the canon, or even authors, because that book is so much from a woman's voice. And so I'm really interested in continuing with that project and continuing to give people the information they need to not say false stuff about biblical women. The stuff we hear like, oh, they couldn't own property. Well, what about Machlanoah, Hogla, Milcah, Tirzah? They could, and so did Naomi. They had no voice. Well, yeah, they actually did. So no, they didn't have the equitable kind of standing that we, many contemporary women long for, and arguably we are in a much better position. But still, the women who are in the Bible have really been overlooked, and there are some stories there that are worth knowing and telling. And so I would definitely like to do more with those. And I do have a little, I'm just going to say it's a surprise project that might be cooking about that, that could get some interesting responses. So we'll see where that goes. But thanks, Helene, for asking. I am doing a lot like this and more later this month on Qoheleth, and trying to think about some more questions about why does Qoheleth matter to us today. I asked a lot of those questions in the commentary, and so I want to continue thinking about that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you came right after class, and we really appreciate your making time for us. And I want to thank everybody for zooming in, probably your millionth Zoom of this pandemic. And let me just remind everybody that you're welcome, more than welcome, for our events this month and for next month. Lindsay Katzier from Langston is speaking of, I know I have the exact title, Ghosts of Dickens' Past, The Death of Judaism and Oliver Twist and Our Mutual Friend. If you've never heard Lindsay, she's quite the live wire, and I recommend it highly. So maybe we could just unmute a little bit for a minute and give Lisa a proper hand.